Channel Show with your host, SatoriD. Today we have a really special crypto hustle update, and we have a special guest here today, Dr. Charles Evan, Associate Professor of Economics Finance at Barry University, Miami, Florida, and also the founding director of Conscious Entrepreneurship Foundation. How are you, Dr. Charles?
Doing very well, thank you.
Good. So actually, I ran across your an article that you posted, and what caught my eye was not only about the court case happening there in Florida, going over is Bitcoin a real currency or real money, and but I saw your response to it that I got quoted in this article, and no journalist ever asked me if it was all right to quote me, and they misinterpret or misquoted you. So I thought that was funny, and I was like, well, I don't mind asking you if I could quote you. And so here we are. Would you mind kind of going over, you're the expert witness in this court case and kind of outlining the court case and what was your part in this case?
Sure. So if we roll the clock back a little bit more than 2 decades, I have been active with what we called e-currencies back in the day. First as an activist, I was the internet person at a foundation that helps nonprofit organizations that focus on free markets get started up around the world. I built the first website. I just finished my master's degree in economics, and that was when David Chaum's eCash had just been released. And I'd been suggesting among the people in developing world countries that export commodities that maybe they should license that software and issue their own e-currencies backed by things other than the national currency. And of course, the first thing that came to mind was gold. And later, it turned out that there were people who were working with using gold as money on the internet. I wound up working with several of those over the course of the mid to late 1990s. And then after the dot-com crash in April of 2000, and then the 9/11 attacks in September of 2001, the industry basically fell off the face of the earth. So I dusted off my graduate degree, went back and finished my PhD in finance, and I've been teaching economics and finance for the past decade or so. And then when Bitcoin came around, it started to look like maybe this was going to be for real. And I started watching it very closely in the early days. I tried my hand at mining, never managed to mine anything, unfortunately. So I think I was a little bit late on that. But then it became pretty clear to me that this stuff might actually live up to its promise. So I started looking more closely. And in the meantime, it's become the primary focus of my academic research. So naturally enough, when you have a paper out there on Bitcoin, I've got one that's an introductory paper. It's called The Blind Economists and the Elephant, where I basically point out that asking if Bitcoin is a currency or a commodity or an asset, or is it a bank, or is it a this, is it a that, is it the other thing, is like the blind monks asking if an elephant is like a fan, is it like a snake, is it like a rope, is it like a tree or a wall. It's all of those things. And Bitcoin is what it is, and everything else that we use to describe it is basically a metaphor. So we end up with our cases down here in Florida. We have a reputation to uphold, so we have financial crime. And the lawyer in one of these cases found out about me through the grapevine and asked if I wouldn't mind serving as an expert witness in this case. And so that's where we are now. And there was a reporter from the Miami Herald actually in the courtroom. I spoke with him very briefly. He told me that normally he covers murders, so this isn't really his area of expertise. And some of the statements that are in the Miami Herald article are not entirely on point. I don't blame the author, by the way. Like I said, this isn't his area of expertise. It was close enough and it was okay. But what I found really odd was I started seeing my name out there on the internet and all of these people quoting me, and it wound up getting all the way up to the level of Time magazine online. And that one just put me over the top, because at the very least, the folks at Time, Time, Newsweek, Wired, Forbes, you'd think that those folks would actually call you up for a soundbite. And it just struck me as odd that the mainstream media basically gets its news from local media and maybe even, heaven help us, blogs. And it just kind of struck me. And so what you saw was me in a moment of exasperation saying, this cannot be how the news gets reported.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating because that's basically them trying to catch up or should establish, your journalistic integrity, and at least, especially now, kind of follow up with you pretty easily. They could have found you, but they wanted to probably just get the story out there, and everybody's kind of, latching on to, yeah, you said, heaven forbid, blogs, and I always cringe when I see which is now like very trendy or the norm, where they quote tweets in the mainstream news. I'm like, oh my god,
Yes,
why are you quoting a tweet?
precisely. Yeah, no, and the thing is, going back through my my CV there. I mean, I'm old enough to be grumpy and irritated about this stuff. No, it's like shades of Hillary Clinton's vast right-wing conspiracy. Good gravy.
Yeah. Okay, so I really like that analogy of what you're talking about, the monks, the blind monks, and the elephant, because it is so true. I think this is kind of like the struggle or the problem right now. And you were talking about how this wasn't the guy's expertise. He usually does murder cases, but I think all of us who are even involved in, say, the blockchain and cryptocurrency world, is that these technologies are so new and such, like, we had no frame of reference prior to this, so it's hard for us. Maybe we understand it, but when we try to discuss it or explain it to someone, I forgot, one of my friends says, like, if we can't explain it to our child or to our grandma, like, then what are we really doing? Like, is as far as trying to get everybody involved. So that analogy is really, I think, right, spot on with the difficulty with trying to, say, discuss any cryptocurrency, and especially Bitcoin. So
Sure.
yeah.
And the other thing is, now try to imagine that you're being asked to explain it to a judge while you're under oath, and every utterance is being recorded by the court reporter. So yeah, if you can't do that, then what are we doing?
Yeah. and it's funny too, because they probably have no idea what any of this stuff is, and it's funny because some of us that are really following it hard, it's even hard for us to say sometimes with the newer stuff coming out to even try to wrap our hands around it, much less some judge who's probably just been hearing court cases for their whole life and then try to bring up blockchain technology and cryptocurrency to them.
Oh, sure. This particular case is in state court. I served as an expert witness in a federal case as well. That one was a little more straightforward. The defendant was accused of importing flocka from China, and he was paying for that with Bitcoin. And the public defender had me come in to explain what Bitcoin was, and mainly he was interested in having me convey to the jury and to the judge in the other case that Bitcoin is not inherently evil. It's like guns, which incidentally are protected by the Constitution. They can be used for good or ill. And so he wanted me there to make sure that I was able to convey the idea that Bitcoin can also be used for good or ill. And but this one was in state court down in Miami. And yeah, I gathered by the looks of the people who were milling around in the parking lot that the judges typically are dealing with things like family issues and, physical crime and things along those lines. And this one, it got to the point where the judge at one point says, toward the end actually, she says, "This is the most interesting case that I've seen in this courtroom probably in a very, very long time." And she took over the questioning of me after the two lawyers were done. And she was very interested, and it was obvious that the stuff was very, very new. But I was also very pleased to see that she was making a genuine effort to wrap her mind around how qualitatively different Bitcoin is from what has gone before. Because if you think of intangible assets, which is what the IRS officials have said Bitcoin is, they say it's an intangible asset, it's intangible property. But an intangible asset is usually something like a patent, a copyright, a trademark, maybe a franchise, things along those lines. And they all get their value from some underlying real thing. So goodwill in a firm is an intangible asset, but it's backed up by the public's belief in the value of that firm. A patent is usually associated with an invention. And this is what intangible assets typically are. And when you get to Bitcoin, it goes beyond intangible and it becomes what I've been calling ephemeral, in that there is no underlying asset that is implied by your Bitcoin holdings. It's basically a record book for keeping track of something that doesn't exist. It's the record is the Bitcoin. There is no underlying thing. And that's where I find people, especially people who've had some training in economics and finance or accounting, that's where we spend most of our time talking, because they oftentimes find it very difficult to accept that billions of dollars are being poured into this system that is basically the Seinfeld show of money. You know, it's a money backed by nothing.
Yeah, that's actually really great. I'm going to start using that. That's Seinfeld of
Yeah,
money.
it was a show about nothing.
Yeah.
And in my Blind Economist paper, I use the image of buckets of sand. I say, imagine that you had 21 million 8-gallon buckets, or 21 million 30-liter buckets. And each one of those can hold 100 million grains of sand. I actually looked this up on Wolfram Alpha. And so you've got these buckets with 100 million grains of sand. That's going to be really cumbersome to use those as hand-to-hand money. So let's just use book entry the same way we do with the banking system. I mean, when I spend money from my account to American Express, nobody comes by and picks up a carload of cash and drives it over to American Express's bank. It's all done through book entry, just, you know, adding and subtracting numbers and databases. And then as I get through the image there, then I say, now ignore the buckets and ignore the sand, but keep the transaction history. That's Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And that's something where I found that people at least pretend to get it at that point. And I even used that image when I was invited to deliver a presentation last year at the Miami branch of the Atlanta Fed. And I was there for 2 hours with Federal Reserve Bank examiners. And it was absolutely delightful. I'm there in my suit with my tie on. Up on the screen, I've got a PowerPoint slide that has a white background, gigantic bold letters, and it says financial superbug. And the bank examiners now are asking me, okay, now hold on a minute. If I have one of these buckets of magic sand, and I knew I'd done my job at that point when I got Federal Reserve Bank examiners to say bucket of magic sand.